Helen is. Helen is a lifelong activist and later life lesbian, if you call 30 later life. Her professional life as a social scientist and educator focused on feminism, sexuality, women's health, women's sport and capitalism. Despite contracting polio as a young child, she was an elite cricketer and competed with success at the Gay Games in Sydney in 2002. Culturally safe aged care for lesbians, the impact of conversion therapy laws on teenage lesbians, human rights and the Sex Discrimination Act are her focus these days. Now, Bronwyn Winter. Bronwyn Winter is an emeritus professor of transnational studies at the University of Sydney and a long-standing lesbian and feminist activist in Australia, France, the UK and transnationally. Among other things, she has written feminist analysis of post-9/11 politics and transnational feminist and lesbian activism, analysed the intersections of race, religion, culture, class, violence, sexuality, the state, and indeed political opportunism in discussions of women and religious, especially Muslimist, identity politics, discussed the history and current expressions of feminist and lesbian theories, debunked the mythology of French feminism made in the Anglosphere, and critiqued the political economy of same-sex marriage, its appropriation by states and markets. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Christine. As you know, I'm reading on behalf of Bronwyn, who has asked me to try and pronounce the French in French, but you will get a very Aussie French accent from me, so apologies to those who may be French speaking. This paper is about lesbians theorising heterosexuality and lesbian political resistance. I'm talking today about the so-called second wave of feminism, but we can find much earlier expressions, often literary, but sometimes not. Those earlier expressions are often coded due to the prevailing heterosexism and the very unthinkability of lesbian existence and resistance. But some are more overt. Pauline Tarn, Renée Vivian, Eugène Barn, Marguerite Antonia Radcliffe Hall. So, the second wave. In 1980, 2 essays were published on different sides of the Atlantic. Both were highly influential within the feminist movement, and particularly radical feminism. The first, Pensée Straight, by Monique Wittig, was published in February of that year in issue 7 of the journal Questions Féministes, but had been delivered at a conference presentation in English in 1978 at the Modern Language Association conference in the US. The second, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence by Adrienne Rich, was published a few months later in the journal Science. Both women were already award-winning literary authors, Rich for poetry and Wittig for novels, essayists and lesbian activists. An activism also expressed through their work. Both saw writing as a political process, but for Wittig, politics extended beyond the subject matter to formal considerations in reworking language, and in particular, the language of gender, both grammatical and sociological. Regrettably, Rich subsequently attempted to soften some of the statements she made in Compulsory Heterosexuality, and in particular stated that she had now embraced the term queer to allude to many kinds of sexual disenfranchisement. Wittig, for her part, softened nothing whatsoever and remained critical of queer, notwithstanding Judith Butler's attempt to appropriate her work and that of Simone de Beauvoir. In a grab bag of statements, Butler cobbled together to prop up her muddled arguments in her first book, Gender Trouble. The debate over lesbian politics and theorisation of heterosexuality split the collective of Questions Féministes where Wittig's essay had been published, and issue 7 was to be the second last. The collective was dissolved in October that year. On March 1, 1981, the radical lesbian feminists, formerly of the collective, including Wittig, wrote and self-published, as a typed and radioed text, a letter to the feminist movement, nicknamed La Lettre Mauve. This last term is probably best rendered in English as the Lavender Letter, in a phrase reminiscent of the Lavender Menace, which in 1970 disrupted the Second Congress to unite women in New York. The Congress had excluded lesbians from the organising groups and its platform. The Lavender Menace women, of whom the best of are known to us today in Australia would probably be novelist and activist Rita Mae Brown, distributed mimeograph copies of the radical lesbian 10-paragraph manifesto, The Woman Identified Woman. The La Lettre Mauve, or Lavender Letter, gave an account of the conflict within Question Feministe, which came down to two differing views of lesbianism. On one hand, as a sexual preference, which, like heterosexuality, was relegated largely to the domain of personal choice and personal psychology. And on the other hand, the position taken by the lesbian dissidents that lesbianism was a political choice by the class of women in the struggle against male domination. They further stated that without the resistance of these women, who reject the oppressor, who direct their affection exclusively towards women, who refuse femininity, feminism could not have existed and could not continue to exist. This last statement is both true and continues to be consistently denied. Lesbians have always been there at the heart of radical feminism, making connections to reveal and to combat the complex system of male domination and its various avatars. Yet lesbians and radical lesbian feminist analysis of heterosexuality have been routinely sidelined as somehow less important or too confronting and thus potentially undermining strategic objectives, or indeed too white Western middle class. I write this as one word, as it has become such a convenient mantra. More often than not, deployed ironically by women who are arguably even more white Western middle class than those they are seeking to discredit. We invariably find this frustrating and tiring, and it often makes us angry. Indeed, a decade before Wittig's and Rich's essays were published, radical lesbians had opened their manifesto with, "What is a lesbian?" A lesbian is the rage of all women, condensed to the point of explosion. And concluded by stating, it is the primacy of women relating to women, of women creating a new consciousness of and with each other, which is at the heart of women's liberation and the basis for the cultural revolutions. Some of these quotes are quite long and they're up on screen. Both radical lesbians and the authors of the Lavender Letter analysed heterosexuality as the core, systematic, structural, cultural and ideological component of domination. In The Straight Mind, Wittig wrote, "Heterosexual society is based on the necessity of the different other at all levels. It cannot function without this concept, not economically, nor symbolically, nor linguistically, nor politically. This necessity of the different other is an ontological one for the whole conglomeration of sciences and disciplines that I call the straight mind. And what is the different other but the dominated? Heterosexual society does not only oppress lesbians and homosexual men, it oppresses many different others. It oppresses all women and several categories of men and all those who are in the situation of being dominated." She further wrote that if we are educated to become women, as Beauvoir famously wrote, in a society where you are heterosexual or you do not exist, then lesbians, in refusing to become that thing called woman, must then be something other, non-woman, non-men, a product of society and not of nature. Moreover, lesbian is the only concept that I know that is beyond the categories of sex, woman and man, because the subject so designated is not a woman, not economically, nor politically, nor ideologically. For in fact, what makes a woman is a particular social relationship to a man, a relationship once called serfdom. She wrote these words in another essay, "One is not born woman." Colette Guillemot, also a co-author of the Lavender Letter, called that social relationship sexage, in a coined term reminiscent of both esclavage, slavery, and servage, serfdom. In a two-part article published in 1978, Guillemot analysed the different forms of appropriation of women by men and the arsenal used to effect that appropriation, constraints on time, restrictions on space, and so on. Wittig continued, "We lesbians are defectors from our class in the same way as American marooned slaves were in escaping slavery and becoming free men and women. Our survival depends on that. Our survival demands that we contribute with all our strength to the destruction of class, that of women, in which men appropriate women, and that can only be accomplished by the destruction of heterosexuality as a social system based on the oppression and appropriation of women by men."
Yes.
Rich wrote along quite similar lines, although stopping short of Wittig's desire that social sex classes cease to exist. Women identification is a source of energy, a potential springhead of female power, violently curtailed and wasted under the institution of heterosexuality. The lie of compulsory female heterosexuality, however we choose to identify ourselves, however we find ourselves labelled, flickers across and distorts our lives. Rich also foresaw the question that inevitably will arise, and that I have no doubt some straight women here today are silently asking, as they do, as they have done every decade, every time lesbians have raised this issue. The question is, are we then to condemn all heterosexual relationships, including those which are least oppressive? Rich believed that question, though often not heartfelt, is the wrong question. Of course there are good and bad heterosexual relationships, ones that are more or less oppressive, with more or less nice, respectable blokes, or what we once jokingly called in Australia, snags, sensitive new age guys. But this is not the point. Rich wrote, while the qualitative differences of experience exist within the institutions of heterosexuality, the absence of choice remains the great unacknowledged reality. And in the absence of choice, women will remain dependent on the chance or luck of a particular relationship, and will have no collective power to determine the meaning and place of sexuality in their lives. As we address the institution itself, we begin to perceive a history of female resistance which has never been fully understood itself because it has been so fragmented, miscalled and erased. It is precisely because heterosexuality, because of sexage, because it is so individualised, so compartmentalised and so routinely justified in the name of love or complementarity or some other social fiction, precisely because women are the only oppressed class, as Simone de Beauvoir noted, not to have a collective identity associated with a time before enslavement, a geographical or social terrain that we can reference, even if only in our imaginations, as an elsewhere of liberation. It is precisely for these reasons that as soon as we start theorising heterosexuality as a system and justifying ideology of oppression, that we hear the yes buts. Yet, as both Wittig and Rich argue, the power men everywhere wield over women is the institution of heterosexuality and has become a model for every other form of exploitation and illegitimate control. In Australia, Denise Thompson, among others, we're privileged to have in our audience, has critiqued the lacunae of feminist accounts of sexuality, theorising heterosexuality as a central institution of male domination. In her book, Reading Between the Lines, a lesbian feminist critique of feminist accounts of sexuality, Thompson explains why she prefers the term phallocentricity to patriarchy. The meaning of the term, she explains, is that the phallus, the penis as a symbol of human status, plays the central role and ruling role in defining social reality. In other words, men rule because they have penises. This is not a statement about anatomy, or rather it is not a statement about an anatomy unincorporated into a symbolic universe within which an anatomical feature is burdened with significance. Hence, the abolition of phallocentricity is not dependent on universal castration, but on a collective refusal to be implicated in the products, processes, structures and institutions which reproduce and reinforce the power of the phallus and what it signifies. The term phallocentricity names the enemy clearly and immediately. Thompson also discusses the sex-gender distinction, which liberal and social feminists of the so-called second wave leapt on, because it seemed to promise the perfect riposte to arguments that the situation of women was determined by biological or natural causes. Yet the sex-gender distinction actually falls into the same trap of essentialism or biological reductionism that feminists positing it sought to avoid in becoming a restatement of the old nature-nurture, body-mind dichotomy. Sex, as biology, is somehow discursively situated outside the social, whereas we have seen from Wittig's arguments above that it sits very squarely within it. However, to argue for dispensing with the sex-gender distinction within feminist theory, Thompson explains it's not all the same thing as arguing that bodies are not relevant. Bodies, especially female bodies, have an intransigence which is potentially disruptive of any ideas we might have about them. Colette Guillemot had made a comparable argument in her 1979 essay, Question de Différence. We are not so different from men as we are different from what men claim us to be. Thompson continues, our biology and bodies have meaning and political relevance only to the extent they are already situated within discourse or culture or society or language. Indeed, it is a characteristic of phallocentric thought that the female body is typically elated from discourse as well as being bespoken in ways which do grave damage to women's physical and psychical integrity. Tellingly, Thompson refers to Moira Gatton's reminder that the gender term, as applying to men and women, was not suggested by a feminist, but a UCLA professor and gender clinic psychiatrist, Robert Stoller, as a handy way of referring to the problem of transsexuality. Stoller was a pioneer of gender identity theory from the late 1950s, and in his book Sex and Gender on the Development of Masculinity and Femininity was extremely influential, being referenced by feminists as diverse as Anne Oakley and Kate Millett. It is the same year he published a second Sex and Gender volume on the transsexual experiment. It is thus deeply ironic and deeply worrying that so many feminists latched on to this social fiction of gender as applied to humans, contributing greatly to landing us into the predicament where we find ourselves today. The illusion, indeed excision, of embodied social experience of women from phallocentric heterosexual discourse and practices means that women do not socially have possession of our own bodies, which means that an attempt to become a subject through the experience of one's own body is doomed to fail. In liberal societies, the most effective means for the dominant class to silence the collective articulation of the embodied experience of the dominated is to co-opt it, and in the process re-script subordination as freedom, with concurrent marginalisation of the uncooperative unco-optables. In modern liberal social orders, wrote Kathy Miriam in 2007, the lived experience of subordination for women is also the lived experience of individual choice. The lived contradiction of choice and subordination is central to women's agency in these social orders, and to the persisting assumption by both men and women of men's sex right. Drawing on the work of Stevie Jackson and Sue Scott, Miriam argues that the liberalisation of sexual norms and more general female agency needs to be understood in terms of the sexual antinomies of late modernity. In their discussion of these antinomies or contradictions, Jackson and Scott wrote that the tension between egalitarian ideas, or rather, I would add, a superficial lip service thereto, and the emphasis on sexual difference, manifested, I add, in the continued role of phallocentric ideology, finds its expression in a new, more assertive style of femininity, a femininity that is out and proud. Yet in actuality, women remain concerned with maintaining appropriately feminine sexual respectability, still lack a language of autonomous female desire and pleasure, and continue to experience coercive sex. Jackson, a heterosexual radical feminist, also published in 1999 a book, Theorising Heterosexuality, in which she criticised feminist accounts and celebrations of heterosex. Among them, Lynn Siegel, as writing as if bodies involved in the sexual relation are untenanted, or as if biographies, social locations, and social identities of their inhabitants have somehow been left behind. There is no history, no context. She warns that it is a mistake to confuse emotional responses during sex, vulnerability, loss of self, loss of control, with the social relations within which sex takes place. Lesbian lives and politics have also been subjected to liberal co-option and re-scripting of subordination as freedom, and of sex bodies as untenanted. To use Jackson's word, Kathy Miriam writes, mass media circulate normal and likeable images of gays and lesbians, and young people hold the liberal attitude that gays and lesbians are just like everyone else. Yet despite this spirit of tolerance for gays and lesbians, the heterosexual presumption remains intact. Miriam further argues that lesbianism itself has been refigured by heteronormativity today as central to the heterosexual norm, that is, for the pleasure of men. Today, many feminists and other women's rights activists, however, they name themselves, including most, if not all, present at this conference, are highly exercised, and rightly so, about the influence of the ideology of gender identity on our laws, policies, health systems, and indeed broader culture. Yet, as we have seen, radical lesbian feminists have been analysing this issue for a long time. We have been doing so not only through our direct experience of combating males, pushing to exercise their sex right in lesbian spaces, and sadly, some lesbians' collusion with that political move, but also theoretically. I think immediately of Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire, published in 1979, around the same time that Vitti, Guillemot and Rich were writing on heterosexuality and men's appropriation of women, and her follow-up work, Doublethink, a feminist challenge to transgenderism, published by Spinifex Press here in Australia. Radical lesbian feminists see very clearly how the fist of gender identitarianism fits perfectly within the boxing glove of heterosexuality as an institution. Each serves the other in a phallocentric system. Men get to demand whatever men want and get to place new constraints on women's freedoms, threaten anew women's safety, exert anew their sex right, and even get to define anew what women are. And if females are inadequate at the task of becoming women in prescribed hetero-feminine ways, then we must become men, or rather mutilated women, because men know very well that only they get to define who they are and who women are. Which is why the transing of children, apart from all the other damage it does, is a profoundly heterosexist move. If women do manage to escape men's control, and most particularly those women fleeing male violence, seeking autonomy as lesbians, or indeed doing things that only women can do, birthing and breastfeeding, then the solution is easy enough. First, allow the specificity of women's embodied experience, as Denise Thompson pointed out, and second, redefine the notion of women to include men, which of course on one level renders the term woman unintelligible, because if men can also be women, then the term is simply a synonym for human. Of course, this means getting rid of the category. This means of getting rid of the category of woman is not what Monique Vitti envisaged, not the least because although women cease to exist, men do not. Yet, on another and equally sinister level, the category of women is even more surreally present, with the ideology of heterosexuality that informs its new definition hiding in plain sight. Our existence as a social sex class is disappeared to be replaced by gender identity, cisgender. Everything is about sex and absolutely nothing is about sex.
Yeah.